I'm Carl Brookins, and this is Minnesota Crime Wave Presents. Welcome once again to a fun and interesting and information-packed program. On my left, a award-winning Minnesota author named William Kent Kruger, writes the Cork O'Connor series set in the great north woods of Minnesota. Maybe Wisconsin, Upper Peninsula a little bit, all those places.
Usually Minnesota.
Usually Minnesota. On my right, award-winning Minnesota author Ellen Hart. We're going to talk a little bit about. I should mention again, I'm sure, although those of you who regularly follow this series know that she writes the Jane Lawless and the Sophie Greenway series, and she's off in dozens and dozens of award-winning stories, and she was once named a princess, but we won't go into that.
No, we don't need to go into that.
And her books usually take place
right.
in Minnesota.
That's right.
That's true. We have three segments. We're going to talk a little bit about an important element of mystery writing. Then we're going to introduce a guest and also award-winning author from Minnesota named David Housewright. And finally, we're going to talk about one of Ellen's books, her latest Jane Lawless book, which to my way of thinking is probably the best book she's written. I've never told her this, and I would say it even if she wasn't sitting here and kicking me in the shins.
Yeah, right.
All right, first, let's talk about setting. How important are they? How do you get there?
Okay.
Why should you worry about it?
You know, setting is an important part of any novel. I think we would all agree with that. And I think it's important not only for the reader, but I think it's really important for the writer as well. It helps you think about your story. It can be so important that it can even become a character in your story.
Apropos of that,
yes,
I tried to write for a very long time before I moved to Minnesota. I moved to Minnesota and began to write about Minnesota, and wonderful things happened. It was Minnesota.
Yeah,
it was the setting.
It's the water.
Interesting. Well, the water, the weather. Okay, my first question to both of you is, how much do you think about setting before you begin your next story?
Oh, interesting question. Well, I don't think about it specifically, although as the story begins to develop, there is a place associated with it. Mm-hmm. And then at some point, I have to look at that place and gradually expand things out and work out what the setting is going to be and how it's going to be used.
Okay.
So I do that as kind of a preliminary.
Because my series is so closely associated with the North Country of Minnesota, I think about it a lot. Because I think about how am I going to use this setting, what haven't I told readers about the North Country that I can tell them about in this particular book. But I also think about it particularly when I'm not going to set a book in Minnesota. The book that I just finished takes place partly in Wyoming, so I had to think about different kind of a setting, and yet I'm so identified as a setting author, how can I make sure that the setting is as important in this story as it would be if I set it in Minnesota?
Absolutely.
Thought about that a lot.
Yeah. We were actually up in northern Minnesota driving around. I don't remember what we were doing last winter, and you kept saying, "Oh, these iron mines and these iron pits and these." I got to write something about the iron mining industry.
There's iron in northern Minnesota. Who would have figured?
Right. So
somebody figured because they took a lot of it for World War II.
Yeah. Do you ever make up things, or do you use absolute real settings?
Well, my sailing series takes place in real places, so I'm always very careful to use the real settings, except when it gets in the way of the story. Rarely does that happen. But I did lose about 3,000 people off an island because I didn't want there to be anybody there to help the protagonist.
Okay.
But the island is where the island is. I've only heard from 2 people who lived on the island who wanted to know why we got rid of them.
Okay. And you write about a place that's real and not real.
Yeah, I take a lot of literary license with the North Country.
Could you explain that?
Basically, I want it to feel right, but I don't want to be so bound to a geographic reality that people go, "Oh, come on, Kent, that river doesn't run that way," or whatever. So I can monkey with the geography to meet the needs of the story. Now, you set your stuff in the Twin Cities.
Yeah, and some of it's real and some of it's not real. I mean, what I tell my students, it's along the lines of, if you're going to set something in a real restaurant and you have someone get food poisoning and die in that restaurant, then don't set it in someplace real. I mean, because you don't want to get sued.
That's kind of an axiom.
I think it is, yeah. So you end up, I think, making things up for that reason. Or you need something specific that you can't find. It's like Agatha Christie. If she couldn't find a poison, she'd make one up. You know, if you can't find the right setting, you can always...
Somebody's father, somebody, or I can't remember his name now, said you should never do that. Make up a poison that you don't. It doesn't really exist.
You probably shouldn't, but you know what?
That's for a different program.
Yeah, I think so.
Probably. But how important is setting? I mean, could you do a story without really?
It depends, I think, on the story. I think.
Have you ever tried it?
Well, I think setting. I think for me, setting is less important than it is for can't say. I mean, you use the weather. It's so complicit in what you write about. However, I can remember one book, the fourth book that I was writing. I had the story, I had the idea, I had the premise and all of that, and it just would not come together. And I finally realized where it needed to be set, and it was like, and I think I've said this before, it was like watching a crystal form. As soon as I had that setting, I could see the whole thing just take shape. So for me, in thinking about a book, setting really does play a very significant role, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a city. It can be, in this case, it was the loft area of downtown Minneapolis.
I think setting and atmosphere are almost inseparable. I use setting to create atmosphere, so the darkness of the woods, or if I want a bright sunny day to reflect on whatever is going on, I'll use it that way. So for me, setting and atmosphere really are intertwined in a very significant way.
You ever cast against type with of a sunny day when bad things happen and an awful day, gloomy day?
I hope
so. Never.
I mean,
I don't like to surprise the reader.
Okay. Are there problems?
Quickly.
Okay. Are there problems that you see in using the settings in Minnesota, specific to Minnesota?
Only because Minnesota is sometimes considered flyover country, and although, as Pete Hauptman once said, some of his editors looked on it as kind of an exotic setting, the way you would look at Indonesia or someplace like that. Well, we're going to revisit this again, of course, because there's a lot more to be said about setting. But since setting is only one important element of the novels, and we'll talk about some others, we tend to comment about important authors and books of crime fiction, and so if you have authors or books that you think you'd like us to talk about, you should email us. We'll give you the address at the end of the program. Meanwhile, take a look at some of the other topics we're going to be discussing, and we'll be back in a few minutes with our guest, who is Edgar Award-winning Minnesota author David Hausreiter.